Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about album number 8 from a guy called Gerald, Tronic Jazz, The Berlin Sessions. Alright, so I just finished covering Gerald's last project, Proto-Acid, The Berlin Sessions, and obviously there was a second round of sessions here. Same label, Laboratory Instinct, but this time it's 4 years later, in 2010, and he's doing a live set of so-called Tronic Jazz. And I say so-called because the title is not entirely accurate to what this album actually delivers. There are a few jazzy elements on a few tracks here and there, but for the most part this is a very straightforward collection of micro house and deep house arrangements. And when you just look over the track listing, in contrast to the Proto-Acid set, which was a single continuous mix split into 24 mostly very small parts, the Tronic Jazz set looks a lot more like a regular old album, with 13 tracks that aren't interconnected in any way, and mostly sit around like 5.5 minutes each. Seems very average looking, and perhaps unfortunately the music itself is also very average. Don't get me wrong, there's still plenty of compelling moments to still make this one worth giving a shot especially if you've been a longtime fan of Gerald's. And at its very worst, this project can make for danceable background music that's absolutely nothing offensive or lacking on a technical front, often creating some smooth atmosphere that'll work quite well, and at worst, some banging groove that's as well crafted as you'd want. A lot of this album just isn't that interesting. These tracks often form a core groove and stick to it for their whole running time. Doesn't feel like it goes as deep or multidimensional as the Proto-Acid set did. And there are unfortunately a fair few clunkers here that just don't really have the texture or memorability to back themselves up. I will say the project definitely starts really strong with its first 3 tracks. People Moover submerges you in a sea of moody pads and plucking arpeggio melodies. Sounds really nice and refreshing, good opener to pull you in right from the outset. Nuvo Alfa has an even more banging drum machine beat with all these orchestral string samples that really give the whole mix some sense of heightened drama and tension that nothing else on the album pulled off as effectively, or even really went for the same feel, save for maybe the album closer Murphed, which was interesting in its mix of jazzy drums and off-kilter melodies, but did kinda leave the album on a weirdly unpleasant note. And Flutter combines bubbly synth plucks and synth string pads that sort of give everything like an early Sounds from the Ground sort of vibe, with some darker pad progressions going up against some interestingly tense bass lines. It's a fun atmospheric cut that has some solid momentum to it. I really like that one. But then eventually you get to some much more sparse cuts like Island or Just Soul, which don't have much more to them than very simple house beats, some occasional synth chords echoing out over some windy air conditioning pads. Not to say they're bad or anything, the former of those two kind of reminds me of Basic Channel, but they do come off a bit underwhelming in comparison to earlier tracks. And these tracks only get more minimal and sparse as you go on. Like, tracks like The Dip, Round Eco, or Dirty Tricks barely even have any melody, just the same old house beats from before, maybe a few synth arpeggios or a neat pad progression here and there. And this stretch just feels rather dull and drab and totally falls in the background. The project does eventually pick up a bit more after that. Wow yeah, or whoa yay. That may run on a bit long for its own good, but the samples shouting the title like the crowd in Wii Sports Resort Basketball, they really stick out in the mix, and the dark progressions of acid synths are pretty fun too. A track like this does use its more minimal construction to its advantage. It's pretty good. And the rapid pizzicato and synth-based plucking of indie vibe is pretty fun as well. And there is one more big atmospheric standout near the end in Conclusion F Minor Blue, which has some really solid and refreshing mixes of pads that mirror the opener quite well as some barely present sorta piano plinks in the background. That one was really nice as well. Though between this track and indie vibe, there is of course one last elephant in the room with Pacific Samba, which as you may guess is a direct rework of the classic 808 State track, Pacific State. More specifically, the original cut from 1989 that Gerald had the most control over. The ever-iconic pad progression going over these same house beats and plucking synth lines, which were also on the original, is a lot better produced than the original because it's no longer 1989 and Gerald obviously has access to much better equipment. But man, hearing this version of the track just has me itching to go back to the Pacific 202 version on the 90 album instead. Gerald may be responsible for the core fundamentals of that track and what made it work so well, and this reworked version is a good demonstration of that. Also, this particular version does fit better with the more minimal focus of the rest of this project, but it also kind of feels like it's missing part of the equation, as well as just kind of lacking in energy. Part of what made the 202 version rise above all the other versions in my eyes was the somewhat goofy flares the other 808 state guys added to the track, the weird instrumental switch-ups and offbeat transitions, and especially Graham Massey's soaring saxophone line. Like, that's the whole hook of the track. Going without it makes the track feel empty and hollow by comparison. Pacific Samba may technically stand out from the rest of this album's track listing in a good way, but it just does not live up to the original in my eyes, and that prevents me from wanting to mark it as a favorite on this project. And yeah, as a whole, this project may have its moments, but it is probably the most underwhelmed I've been by any of Gerald's main albums. I may have to attribute that partially to the album's title. Gerald promised Tronic jazz and instead delivered a really straightforward minimal house effort, which only very occasionally delivers on some jazzy flares. The guy's hyping me up for something that I wasn't actually gonna get. If you go in knowing what you're actually in for, it is fine for what it is. But even so, in the bigger scheme of the genre, I mean, this project is certainly competently produced and engineered and all that, but it just doesn't really stick out from the crowd. There are plenty of better minimal house and minimal techno projects out there, and while Gerald sometimes pulls off this more minimalistic sound well, it doesn't always play to his strengths. This thing can be pretty dang spotty. I don't know. It's a serviceable, low-stakes project that can still have its place, but it is probably my personal least favorite offering of his overall, and I'm overall feeling a 6.3 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.